It's a pleasure to be here to speak to you this evening. Thank you, Shelvin, for the introduction, but I request you to forget all that he said. It's not important. What is important is what I'm going to say now. First of all, am I properly audible to everybody? Okay. Uh, I have a confession to make. I like young people who rebel and who are not disciplined and who break rules. So if you guys end up breaking the boundaries between the lecture and the Q&A and the tutorial, I will not have a problem. So we can make this as interactive as you like, and I would like to try and excite you about the kinds of things that excite me. This subtitle is not mine. It was given by the gallery. It is slightly different from my subtitle, but importantly different, and I will come to that. I will tell you what my title is. As was mentioned, I am interested in social life. Social life in animals, in plants, in humans, in insects, throughout the living world. I'm interested in social life. I'm interested in understanding why some animals are social and others are not. What are the benefits? What are the disadvantages? What are the costs of being social? In particular, I spend most of my time studying insects because it may come as a surprise to some of you, but the largest number and the most sophisticated animal societies are present in the insect world. They put even us to shame in the way in which they run and manage their societies. And so there's a great deal of interest. Simply by being a human being who is a social creature, there's a great deal of interest in understanding how insects, who are so far removed from us in evolution, belong to a completely different sub-kingdom of life. How do they deal with the problems that we all face when we are in a social group? I'm sure all of you have experienced the problems of being in a social group. How do they, what kind of problems do they experience? How do they deal with them? And so the interest is primal. It's because I'm a social animal, I'm interested in other social animals. Let me give you a brief introduction to insect societies. So I'll ask the question, what are insect societies? Many species of insects, particularly ants, bees, wasps, and termites, live in groups. Actually, they live in complex societies and they organize themselves in ways that sometimes resemble our societies, sometimes surpass our societies. Honeybees, of course, are perhaps the best known examples of insect societies because they also have great practical importance. Humans and honeybees have had a very, very long association with each other. Some of you may know that before we got into the habit of extracting sugar from cane or beetroot, the only source of sugar was honey. People use honey as the only source of sugar. So we've had a long association with honeybees. Honeybees live in these complex societies. There are 10 to 15 different kinds of honeybees in the world. But there are 4 major types of honeybees. And of those 4, 3 are found in India and Asia and 1 in Europe. There were no honeybees in America or Australia. They were introduced by human beings. But 3 of those 4 are found in India. The major difference between these 3 is that one is very small, and that's this one. This is in fact called the Asian dwarf honeybee. It's a very small bee, builds very small nest, open nest in the garden like this, hanging from the branch of a tree. Then there are bees which live in cavities. This is what we call Epicerana, or this is the beekeeper's bee. This is the bee that has been domesticated, and one of the reasons why it was easy to domesticate is because it naturally likes to live in cavities. It looks for cavities in dead trees or in rocks and lives inside those cavities. So we can make a wooden box and put them inside. And so it's easy for us to rear. And those are the bees which are domesticated, from which we get our honey and wax and so on. Then there is a much more aggressive, much larger bee which also nests in the open like this, but the bees are large, the nests are large, they can be quite aggressive, and this is called the giant rock bee, which is actually what you see in many of the buildings and the trees you see here, all around here. That's the giant rock bee. You rarely see the Epicerana because they are hidden in cavities. You rarely see this because they are very small and inconspicuous. Most of the bees that you see, which might even come and nest in your building, that is the that is the giant rock bee. This is, as I said, Epicerana. Typically, in a bee colony, there are anywhere between 10 and 60,000 bees. Of these bees, there is only one bee which is unique, and we call it the queen bee. This is the only bee that actually reproduces. She is the only bee who has mated. She has sperm stored from the male she has mated with. She can lay eggs, and she is the only reproducing individual inside the colony. There are, from time to time, you will come across a few male bees. These male bees are called drones, and the most characteristic thing about the drones is that they're lazy. They do very little. They're lazy. They don't do anything. They don't do any work, and they don't participate in domestic life, in social life. They stay in the nest of their birth for about a week or so, and then they start going out in search of virgin queens from other colonies. If they're unsuccessful, they will come back, and they'll keep on doing this until they find a virgin queen with whom they can mate. And interestingly, if they succeed in mating, they die, and they do not survive beyond that. So the rest of the colony consists of these smaller so-called worker bees. These are females, and they are nearly sterile. So they do not reproduce, and there are tens of thousands of them, and they do all the work that is required to build the nest and run the colony. And they do this work in a fairly orderly manner. And what a bee will do depends largely on its age. Not so much on its absolute age, but on its relative age. Am I the youngest member of the group? If I'm the youngest member of the group, my job is basically to sweep the floor. So they are cleaners. They will clean the cell, including the cell from which they are born. And when they grow a few days later, their wax glands begin to develop. And so they are able to drink honey or nectar, which is converted into honey, and metabolically convert that into wax. And they secrete this wax outside the body, and using that wax, they build these kinds of hexagonal cells that you see here. These are all made from wax. They build these cells. So they are called builder bees. So they were cleaners, then they graduate into becoming builders. And a few days later, other glands in their mouth, in their mandibles develop, through which they can produce very many chemicals. These chemicals are required to be added to the food of the young bees. And once they have that capacity, they will take the pollen grains which are stored and the honey which is stored, mix it up, and add some of their own secretions and make into what we call a bee bread. And they will then use that to feed all the larvae. So we call them nurse bees. So now they graduated into becoming nurse bees. A little bit later, they will start doing the food processing. So when nectar is brought from outside, it is very dilute. It has to be concentrated, and it has to be preserved. So they actually concentrate this nectar by evaporating the water, by fanning their wings and evaporating the water, and then it becomes concentrated. That concentration itself makes it difficult for the bacteria to grow in it, but they also add some antibiotics to that, and that becomes honey. So they do the processing of the food. Then they start moving towards the edge of the nest, and their job then is to receive and unload the food being brought by foragers. Foragers who are bringing pollen and nectar, especially those who are bringing nectar, they have no time. So they want to quickly regurgitate it to some bee which is waiting, go back and bring some more. And these bees will collect that, store it in the appropriate place and concentrate it on. Then they will become guard bees. Then they will be looking out for any intruders who might come to the nest. Bees have many enemies, but their biggest enemies are other bees from other colonies who want to come and steal your food. Instead of going to a flower and getting that little bit of nectar, it's so much easier to go here. There's a kilogram of honey here, just steal from here. The bees try to do that all the time and they are repelled. So the guard bees will actually smell every bee that's trying to enter the hive and decide, are you one of us or not? And by the smell they can decide, if you're one of us, get in, otherwise you are repelled. This much they do in about the first half of their lives. After that, they will leave the nest, go out in search of food. Their food consists of only two items, nectar and pollen grains, both of which they collect from flowers. They also occasionally collect some plant resins or sap, which they will apply. For example, you might see that in this photograph. They will apply to the edges to prevent ants and so on from walking onto the nest. Other than these are only three materials they collect from the world. And this resins, which is called propolis, very rarely, but nectar and pollen on a regular basis. When a bee finds a source of nectar or pollen, it is not able to transport all of it back because it can bring very little at a time. It is able to come home and communicate this information to the other bees as to what it has found, how much of it, and how to get there to find it. And this they communicate through a dance language. They perform a dance, and in the dance, there is information about the quality, the quantity, the direction, the distance. I won't talk about the dance language today, that's another lecture by itself. But through that, they will inform, and then the bees who are watching the dance will get this information. Then they can go out and harvest this without any further help from the original bee which you can actually capture the original bee and you can show that the bees which have watched the dance will actually be able to go and get all of this. This is a picture of the queen bee. The queen bee is significantly larger than the worker bees. And what you are seeing in this picture is that a small group of worker bees have surrounded, literally garroted the queen bee. And the queen bee in some ways is at the mercy of these worker bees. These worker bees at the moment are on a special duty, and that we call the royal duty. Their job is to take care of the queen. They lick the queen, they clean the queen, they feed the queen. Because she's too busy, she can't do any of this herself, because she is drinking honey, converting this into nectar, converting into protein and laying eggs. The queen can lay thousands of eggs per day, and she's taken. So as she moves, they will move with her. You decide whether she is being treated as a queen or being treated as a slave, because as a captive, because she cannot move anywhere else, and she's completely dependent on these workers. The interesting thing is that these workers who are on this special royal duty, in fact, we call this the royal retinue. They seem to lose interest in their job after a few minutes, and they'll go off and do something else. Other bees who are doing other things will come and replace them. So they do this job in shifts of small durations. Now there is a very interesting consequence of this, and that is a large number of bees will get an opportunity to be in the physical vicinity of the queen. It's not only these few chosen ones, but everybody, many of them can get a chance to be close to the queen. Now, why should you be close to the queen? Apart from laying eggs, the only other thing that the queen does is she produces chemicals. And these chemicals contain information, and they are needed for the workers. So a large number of workers will get first-hand information from the queen, which then they will spread to the rest of the colony. If only a few bees got information, then they will have to spread. And as you know, when information goes towards many steps, it gets polluted, it gets diluted, it gets corrupted, it gets changed. So first-hand information is given. What you see on the next slide is, of course, a bee trying to collect. Now, what this bee has done here, I put this picture to show you that the bees collect nectar and pollen in two different ways. When they find nectar, they suck it up and store it in a little thing called the crop. This is not their stomach, it is the crop, and therefore it does not get digested. Then they can go to the hive and just regurgitate that nectar to the waiting bee. But they collect pollen in a very different way. In fact, they do not actively collect pollen. When they're going from flower to flower, pollen rubs off on their body, especially with all the hairs that you saw here, all the hairs on the body, it rubs off, and while they're flying, they brush their body and pack all the pollen grains into two places in the hind legs, which we call pollen baskets. And these are you can see here, there's a lot of pollen here, there's a lot of pollen here. They are called pollen baskets. They collect all this, go home and deliver this. When I was introduced, you were told that I am an evolutionary biologist. Evolutionary biologists are especially interested in insect societies because insect societies do something that superficially at least seems to defy Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin's theory of natural selection is roughly understood as survival of the fittest. But what bees do is they are altruistic. They sacrifice themselves. Now, one of the main ways in which they sacrifice themselves for the good of the colony is that the workers don't reproduce. So the Darwinian currency is offspring, and they don't produce any offspring. They spend their whole life working for the queen and her children. So that's already altruistic. Even more extreme altruism is when many of you may have been stung by a bee. If you have not yet been fortunate, I hope you will be one day, because one sting in a lifetime is a good thing to have, good experience. When the bee stings you, you may get a little pain, but she dies. Stinging is an act of suicide because the sting has barbs pointing outwards, and when the bee inserts its sting into your body, she cannot withdraw it. She tries, of course, and when she tries, her abdomen ruptures, and she will leave behind the sting, part of her digestive system, and the poison gland behind, and she flies away only to die within a few minutes. So if next time you are stung by a bee, don't chase that bee. That bee is not going to do any harm to you or to anybody else. She's going to die within a few minutes. Instead, if you have the presence of mind, stop and locate this little sting and remove it. Because if you don't, this poison gland, without the owner, will continue to pump venom into your body. And with the help of very kind altruistic volunteers, it has been measured that it can do it for 60 seconds after the bee has gone away. This is a supreme act of sacrifice, literally giving your life for the welfare of the colony. And this, as you can see, flies in the face of the theory of natural selection. So the theory of natural selection had to be modified to accommodate this kind of altruism. And that's one of the reasons why we study these. Apart from admiring and understanding the ways in which they do it, how do they behave, but we are also interested in why do they do what they do. Bees, of course, are not the only insect societies. Ants are equally famous, in some ways more famous, because while there are a few species of bees, depending on whom you ask, I think nobody will claim that there are more than 15 species of honeybees in the world, but there are 15,000 ant species, and all of them are highly social. They also build complicated nests. They also have queens. They also have lazy males. They also have workers who do all these kinds of things. In addition, the ants have done something which the bees have not done. And that is, the bees, although they do different tasks as they grow up, their body is the same. The same bee graduates from one task to the other as it grows. In the case of ants specialize in doing different jobs, are born differently. They look different. Look at these species. All of these ants belong to the same species, in fact, belong to the same colony. Look at this ant. This ant is very good at picking up small seeds and carrying them back to the nest. At this job, this one is hopeless. It's too big. But this is a good soldier. So when these are marching with food, a few of these will march alongside and defend them. So depending on the job they do, their body is different, their body structure is different, shape is different, size is different. They are born like that. As adults, insects do not grow, do not change their shape and size body. All the growth happens with insects before they become adults in the larval stage. At adult, they cannot change. So this will be a seed carrier and cannot ever become a soldier. This will be a soldier and cannot become a seed carrier. So there is a morphological difference depending on what they do. And sometimes that can be extreme. There's a friend of mine called Mark Moffat in the United States, and he actually came and spent some time at the Indian Institute of Science. He did part of his PhD work here, so I've known him for a long time. He is also a very good photographer. He often contributes photographs to the National Geographic magazine. And he found this Malaysian ant, which holds the world record for the difference in size between two members of the same colony and same sex. Being a little mischievous as he is, he placed the smallest member of a colony on the head of the largest member of the colony and took this scanning electron micrograph. Both are females, both are same species, both live in the colony, but they are very different in size. This is the world record for variation in size. It turns out that this guy, or I should say gal, because all of these are females, she weighs 500 times this individual. That's the extent of variation. But they are the same species. In fact, they come from the same egg. Depending on the environment, depending on the food given, an egg which hatches into a larva can either grow up into this or into this. That brings me to the third category and my favorite category. I am not going to talk to you today about termites, that's the fourth category. But the third category are wasps. There are many, many species of wasps in the world, many thousands of species. Not all of them are social. In fact, the vast majority are either solitary or they are parasites. But a few species, a few thousand species of wasps are social. Technically, all social wasps can be called paper wasps. Why? Because they build their nest from paper. Not from wax as honeybees do, not from soil as termites do, not from leaves as ants do, but from paper. Now, where do they get paper from? They manufacture paper. How do they manufacture paper? Exactly as we manufacture paper. They will scrape cellulose fibers from plants, add various chemicals to it, make it into a fine pulp, spread it into a thin layer, fan their wings and dry it. You can write on it, it's actually paper. This is one particular example of a particularly vicious wasp, which is colloquially called a hornet. And what this wasp does is it covers the entire nest with an envelope also made of paper, leaving only a small opening here for the foragers to fly in and out, so that the whole colony is protected. Now, if you are brave enough and protect yourself well, you can open this envelope, as I did once. It was an unforgettable experience. And when you do that, what you see is what I like to call a multi-storied apartment complex. All of this is made from paper, but you can see here the first floor, second floor, third floor, fourth floor, fifth floor, sixth, seventh, eighth. These are all layers of paper comb in which they rear their brood. If I turn this around, what you will see is this. These are all the pupae of the wasps. What you see here is silk. This silk is made by the larvae themselves. When they complete development, they will close that cell with the silk, and from this an adult wasp will come out. I don't like these wasps for two reasons. One is they're too shy. They cover everything, so I can't observe them. Very hard to study them. But there's a stronger reason why I hate them. I dislike them because they cover their nests. I hate them because they eat the wasps I study. They are major predators of honeybees, other wasps, and so on. So this is not what I study. What I study is this beautiful creature. This is also a paper wasp. This also builds its nest from paper, but there are many advantages. First, I think it's very beautiful. Second, its nest is a two-dimensional structure. It's not, so you can see everything. If you put a camera, you can record everything. They do not build an envelope. They do not cover themselves. But they also have the same kind of hexagonal cells. They also have the larvae, the pupae, the eggs, and these are the adult wasps. And you can study, you can see all of them. You can see everything that they do. Nothing is hidden from your view. It's really beautiful to watch, very interesting to watch these wasps. So this is what I study. Technically, as you know, every creature has a scientific name which has two parts, a genus name and a species name. This is technically called Ropalidia, which is the genus name, marginata, which is the species name. This is the wasp that I have been watching with great fascination since April 1969 till today. Because you can't help it. Once you start watching it, it's really very, very interesting to watch. Now, people often ask me, you are a reasonably looking grown adult man, you should be more responsible. Why do you waste your time with these things? So why do people study insect society? Why should we even care? It turns out that there are many, many very good reasons. The first set of reasons are there are many, many practical applications of the knowledge that you can get from studying insect societies. There are applications in pharmacology. There are huge applications in physiology and medicine. There are applications in telecommunication and division of labor. In fact, the France Telecom company hires people who study ants to learn how to process or how to route their telephone calls more efficiently by learning how the ants do that. Internet technology benefits a great deal from understanding how ants do. In fact, there is a whole subfield of computer science called ant colony optimization. And using that, they develop many algorithms which are used today in computer science. Most of the people have never seen an ant, but they use the wisdom that you get from ants. Of course, social insects have decentralized work organization because there is no leader telling them what to do. They don't have a leader because there are 50,000 individuals, or in the case of ants, there could be 1 million individuals in the colony. There cannot be one person telling them what to do. They are a decentralized organization. Each insect knows a few things, it only does those things, and colony level properties emerge. So there is decentralized work organization which humans like to learn from them. How to do this, how to manage a group of people, whether it's in a factory or in a school or in an organization, how to organize labor without top-down leadership. There's a great deal we can learn from insect societies. Robotics and AI are learning a great deal from insects. People who make robots learn from insects. People who want to study artificial intelligence look at insects. To just give you one example, people were interested in knowing how honeybees, when they fly, they seem to know exactly how far they have flown. How do they know that? Because they are able to measure the movement of the image of the environment on their eyes. And since they can measure that, they know how far they have gone. And using that, they are able to change their speed of flight. And people who are constructing artificial vehicles like drones use this knowledge to make the drones fly more efficiently. So there's a great deal we can learn in terms of in practical terms. But this group of young people shouldn't be worried too much about practical things. You should have fun. So there is curiosity. How can we possibly turn away from little insects who are fighting for a territory, who are sacrificing themselves to save each other's lives, who are practicing agriculture? Ants discovered agriculture 50 million years ago, and they practice agriculture. There are ant species in which there are 1 million mouths to feed every day, And all the food comes from their agricultural produce, not which they collect from their environment. Imagine the scale of their agriculture. Imagine the problem with lack of soil fertility. Imagine the problem of pests. They deal with all of these problems, and we can learn how they do that. They care for the injured. They carry back injured individuals and take care of them. They even treat them medicinally with secretions in their body. They build structures with exquisite architecture. If you open up a termite mound, you will see exquisite architecture, or even an ant nest. This list is endless. And that is enough for me and should be enough for most people to become interested and to study social insects. My view of science is that you should do science for satisfying your curiosity. These will happen on their own. It's not that you need to go looking for them. It's much more efficient if you do science to satisfy your curiosity, applications will follow. And the motivation, of course, will be very high because you are doing it out to satisfy your curiosity. There are two ways of doing science. One is to fill gaps in knowledge. I call this the gap filling mode. The other is to solve puzzles. I call this the puzzle solving mode. Science is best done in the puzzle solving mode. Gaps will get filled automatically. If you have to fill a gap, somebody has to motivate you. If you're doing to solve a puzzle, nobody has to motivate you. The puzzle itself will motivate you. This is my title. Not understanding an insect society, but can we understand an insect society? I think scientists, like everybody else, but especially scientists and politicians, should be very modest. We should not think, of course we can understand it. In my research group, we take this question very seriously. It's a question. Can we understand? Who knows? Maybe we can't. We are so different. We are human beings. We are so different from them. Maybe the ant may laugh at us and say, look at this guy, what he's concluding. That's not really why I am doing this. So we have to be very modest and we should ask, can we understand insect society? So it's always a question. In fact, when I give talks, I start with this question and I tell the audience, I'm not going to answer this question. You have to answer this question. I leave it to you to decide whether I and my students have understood anything at all. That's not something for me to boast. That's something for you to understand. So we take this very seriously and we remind ourselves of this Greek philosopher who said, nature loves to hide. And we remember him all the time. That is what gives us caution in our work. But we also remember another philosopher called Sir Francis Bacon, who said nature does not unveil its secrets except under the torture of experiments, which means there is some hope. You can do some experiments and understand. So between this hope and caution, we tread very cautiously and we try to understand that particular insect society, Ropalidia marginata. And I'll give you a little glimpse of how we do it. I want to spend as much time telling you how we do something than what we have found. Scientists err in only communicating the products of their research, not how they found it. And therefore, science sounds like magic to outside. I know this, believe me. Whereas what we should be telling people is how we did something. I would argue, as I will show in the next slide, okay, let me digress for a moment, just a little bit about how we study them. Depends on the insect you're studying, depending on the question you ask. But for my kind of insects, there are only two real important things that you need to do. Once I learned these two things, the world is endless for me. One is that I learned how to mark every wasp with colored little spots of colored paint. So we don't catch the wasp, we don't anesthetize the wasp, we don't disturb it, we wait for it to be busy and then we put little spots of colored paint on the bodies of the wasp. And based on the colors, based on which part of the body, which color has been put, every wasp has a name. And this name is, and therefore these days every wasp has a computer file. And in that, we keep recording all that wasp has done throughout its life in its computer file. In earlier days, every wasp had a notebook. Now every wasp has a notebook in my computer. So every wasp has a name, and by marking them in this way, that was the first significant advance. If you have unmarked wasps, they all look the same and you cannot make out what's going on. But the moment they are marked, you can learn a great deal. The second thing is, and that's particularly nice about this wasp, these wasps, first of all, they like to live around human habitation. So it's very easy to find them. You don't have to go to the forest. In fact, they often come and build their nest in your house, in your garden. They come to me rather than I go to them. So you can study them wherever they are. In addition, I discovered that you can also move them to the lab and put them in closed cages, and they're quite happy to do that. So for some of our questions, to answer them, we study them wherever they are. In the garden, in the kitchen, in the bathroom, in the bedroom. I'm known to go to people's house and say, please leave this bedroom for me for 15 days. I want to study the wasp which is nesting there. You please use some other room, and so on. Or we can also keep them in the lab. So I constructed a lab, and the lab is unlike any other lab that you have seen because the lab doesn't have any walls. What it has is a wire mesh screen all around, and I've adjusted the size of that wire mesh screen so that my wasp can go in and out freely, but that big fellow who eats these wasps cannot come in. And inside that, I can keep them in all kinds of enclosures. These are little plastic boxes in which I could rear wasps. In fact, we've done many, many experiments just by keeping wasps in this kitchen box. This is a little plastic box that you use in the kitchen to store rice, etc. So we bring this to the lab and we give a little ventilation here. We keep it upside down so that on the lid we can feed the wasps. We can also keep them in cages of this kind or even much larger cages. You can study them in the wild, and the wild fortunately is your garden or your kitchen or your bathroom, and lab is just this wire mesh room. Now I want to spend 2-3 minutes talking about this. As I had begun to say, I think the process of doing science is as important as communicating the process is as important as communicating the product. I would argue that communicating the process is more important than communicating the product, because the product of your research may be of interest to a few people, but the process may be much more broadly interested. Failure to communicate the process, as I said, makes science sound like magic and creates a barrier between science and society. And to break that barrier, we must communicate the process by which we do. So I will try and communicate the process. Even if I can communicate very few products, I will spend time to communicate the process. So let me tell you how we do research. First, I already said these wasps are very beautiful, and if you mark them, they're extremely interesting to watch. You will never get bored sitting in front of a wasp colony. And you shouldn't get bored and fall asleep, because then you will get stung. If you are awake and you know what they are doing, it's very easy to learn how not to get stung. So I and my students, we watch these wasps mainly for pleasure. As I said, you'll never get bored because there's always something interesting happening. And as we watch them, obviously some questions arise in our mind. Why did that wasp do that? How did that wasp do this? And we realize that most of these questions cannot be answered. It's not easy to answer them. But it's fun thinking about it. But every now and then, we come across a question which we think, maybe that question I can answer if I do something. If I do an experiment, if I do something more, I may be able to answer that question. So then we do whatever that something more is, which may involve more observations, it may involve an experiment, it may involve manipulating, it may involve putting the wasp nest in a closed cage, whatever it is we do. And we think we have an answer. We have a tentative answer. All answers are tentative, by the way. All science is tentative. Science is always work in progress. Anybody can question the best established scientific theories and say, I don't agree with you. That is the beauty of science. It's a work in progress. Those little kids there can overthrow everything that I have done before. So answer is tentative. But even before we know how much confidence to have in the answer, we immediately have a dip in our confidence. We say this answer cannot be correct. Because the answer, as stated, raises several other questions. And until we can answer those questions, we cannot have any confidence in these questions. And so, of course, now, obviously, we want to answer those questions. So nobody needs to tell us work hard, it automatically happens. Because you are now highly motivated to answer the second question because you want to know whether your first answer is valid. So then we do whatever needs to do to answer the second question. And when we answer the second question, our confidence in the answer to the first question goes up one notch. But not in the answer to the second question yet, because there's a third question to ask. And so this series of questions and answers goes on. That's how we do our research. And that's how I'm going to explain our research to you by a series of questions and answers. I have chosen 7 questions. We have probably answered 50, 60, or maybe 100 questions, but I've chosen 7 here. If time permits, I will go through these 7 questions. Tell you what is the question we asked, why did it occur to us, what did we do in order to try and answer that question, what did we find, and what is our answer, and why was it not satisfactory, because what questions did it raise which made this answer unlikely. Okay? Now, unlike the honeybees and ants I showed you, there's one peculiarity about these wasps, and that is you don't see a queen. I showed you that large queen surrounded by workers. I showed you ants of different sizes. All of them are identical. They all look the same. So where is the queen? Do they have a queen at all? It turns out that they have a queen. And that queen is as much in control as the honeybee queen. She's the only one who reproduces. Nobody will challenge her. But she looks like everybody else. In fact, you cannot identify her until you wait and see her actually laying an egg. When you see her laying an egg, then we mark her and say, okay, this particular individual which has this kind of color spot is in fact the queen. We learn and write down. Because by looking at her, you can't make out. So the first obvious question that occurred to me when I started looking at these wasps was, if the queen looks like everybody else, she must be behaving differently. Otherwise, where is the difference? So the question I asked was a very simple question. How does the queen behave compared to the rest of the colony? Notice that these questions are common sense questions, which will occur to anybody. Science should always begin as common sense. Only when common sense fails you, like you're doing quantum theory or something, then you bring in something else. Typically, scientists say, no, that common sense is for common people. I am going to start as a scientist. It doesn't work that way. Start with common sense. Most of the time, common sense is adequate. So common sense question, how does she behave? Now what does behave mean? I did again what common sense suggests. I took a notebook and a pencil and sat down in front of these colonies with the wasp marked, and I started writing down what do they do. And I used common sense, therefore I used common words. So I found that a wasp is sitting, I found another is walking, another is flying, another is biting another wasp, another is bringing food, another is inspecting, another is feeding the larva, and so on. So I started simply making a list of all the things that these wasps do in plain English. And the list grew to almost 100 items. Now I said, now I need to find out which of these the queen will do and which of these the workers do. Then I know how the queen behaves differently. It turns out that the queen can do all 100 and the workers can do 99 because they cannot lay eggs. Other than that, they can do everything. So there is no difference between queens and workers, even in behavior. But there must be a difference. So how might that be? Then I argued, maybe the queen can do everything, but does she do? In other words, how much time does each wasp spend in each kind of behavior? How much time do they spend walking, sitting, flying, bringing food, cleaning, etc.? Therein may lie the difference between queen and worker. So I developed methods by which I could actually measure the proportion of time each wasp spends in each behavior. 5% in this behavior, 10% in that behavior, 20% in this behavior. And this kind of calculation, of course, it's like how, in other words, how do the wasps budget their time to do different things? Just like how we spend our money to do different things, how do they spend their time in doing different things? And this is called a time activity budget. So I calculated a time activity budget for lots of wasps, and I got lots of numbers, of course. You can imagine a huge table with names of wasps here, names of activities here, and inside written what proportion of the time. Now, when you have such a large data set, you can apply some kind of statistical analysis to that. You can try to understand. There was a lot of variability. Wasps differed from each other a great deal in how they divided their time, but I wanted to know whether there is any kind of pattern in this variability. So there are certain kind of statistical techniques that you can apply, which you don't have to go into. But applying those two techniques, we discovered, our first major discovery was, to our great surprise, we found that in any colony, there are 3 kinds of wasps. And based on what they did, the most important thing they did, we named them. One group we called sitters. They were just sitting, doing almost nothing. So we called them sitters, why not? Then there was a group which was very nasty, aggressive wasps. They were fighting and chasing other wasps a lot. So we said, let's call them fighters. And then there were some honest, hardworking wasps which spent most of the time going out and bringing food. So we use the word foraging for bringing food. So we called them foragers. 3 kinds of wasps. So at this stage, we have to come back and remember, what was our question? How does the queen behave in reference to the others? Now, I still don't know who is the queen here. Now, I must tell you that I deliberately did not tell my computer who is the queen, because I don't want to bias. So, time activity budgets I calculate for all wasps, analysis done for all wasps. There are 3 groups: sitters, fighters, foragers. Now I can come back and ask, where is the queen? Is she a sitter? Is she a fighter? Is she a forager? But of course, we also know, we read the literature, we know what other people have found. And from what we knew about wasps, the obvious answer to this question was, the queens must be fighters. Because in other such species which had been studied, it was shown that the queen is a real bully. She is the most aggressive individual, and she literally constantly bites and chases and harasses all the other wasps, and that's how she makes them work. And that's how she prevents them from challenging her. So both controlling their reproduction and making them work is done through physical aggression, physical harassment. This was known in other species. For a scientist, nothing is better than finding a result which is not in the textbooks. Students may think, oh my God, my experiment didn't work. Everybody knows this, but when you get that, you should consider yourself very lucky. We found, to our great surprise, that our queens were never fighters. They were always lazy sitters. In colony after colony, our queens were lazy sitters. So what is the answer to our question? The queen in this species is a non-aggressive, non-interactive, meek and docile sitter. This is the answer, but I'm almost embarrassed to tell this to anybody. How can it be true? It can't be true. Because if she's a meek and docile, non-interactive, non-aggressive sitter sitting in a corner, why should the workers obey her? Why should they respect her? Why should she even be the queen in the first place? So you can see that until you answer that question, you're almost embarrassed about this answer. The data tells you that this is the answer, but we can't have too much faith in it, because how can it be? It can't be. So we have a new question. If the queen is such a meek and docile sitter, how did she become a queen in the first place? If there's a bully biting everybody, of course the workers will say, all right, but here there's this meek and docile sitting somewhere in a corner. Why should she be chosen as the queen? So now we have a new question, and we have to answer this question if we are to have any confidence at all in the answer to the first question that the queen is a meek and docile, non-aggressive, non-interactive sitter. Till then, we can't hope to have any confidence in that. So we had to answer this question. How does she become a queen? So we said, well, the only way to answer this question is we should watch when she becomes a queen. So far, we have been watching after she has become a queen. We have to watch a bit. Now, luckily, that is possible because in these species, there are no differences in size and shape. So if the queen dies, one of the workers will become the next queen. Therefore, we can watch. So we designed an experiment. Remember what Francis Bacon said, you can reveal something by doing experiments. And so we designed an experiment of the following kind. So we said, on the first day, we will study all the wasps, the queen and the workers. In our case, study means calculate the time activity budget. How much time each wasp is spending in each behavior. Day 1, do this for the whole day. On day 2 in the morning, we would go with the forceps, remove the queen. Because now we know who the queen is, we have seen her lay eggs. Remove her and study the remaining colony minus the queen for the whole day. That is, determine now how do all the workers spend their time. When we did that experiment of the first time, at the end of day 2, my student said, what do I do with that queen whom I removed this morning? We had put her in a little glass bottle, given her a drop of honey just to keep her happy, and she seemed very happy. So what do we do with her? So I told my student, well, the experiment is over. Why spoil the fun for her? Put her back, let them continue. But we were very curious to know what will happen if we reintroduce the queen. So we reintroduced the queen, and on the third day, we again studied all the wasps, the queen and the workers. How did they spend their time? Did it make a difference? First there's the presence of the queen, then there's the absence of the queen, and there's the queen come back. What is the difference between these 3 days? That is the experiment. That is the experimental design. What did we find? We found to our great surprise that as soon as we removed the queen, literally all hell broke loose. Compared to many other species in the world, our species, I would say, is a fairly mild species. There are some fighters, they occasionally bite and chase individuals, but it's a very controlled, civilized, polite thing. But once you remove the queen, the number of acts of aggression increased many-fold. In some colonies, they doubled. In some colonies, 4 times, 8 times, 10 times, 20 times, 30 times more biting, chasing, aggression compared to in the presence of the queen. What was even more surprising is since all wasps were marked, all of this new aggression was shown by only by one wasp. One worker became hyper-aggressive as soon as we removed the queen. This is what it would look like. So this is the individual which shoots up her aggression in the absence of the queen. The same individual is doing very little on the previous day. And you return the queen, she will drop. In the absence of the queen, she will show her hyper-aggression. In fact, if you don't return the queen, interestingly, she will still drop her aggression within about a week's time, bring it to 0, and become the new queen. Now she is a meek and docile, non-interactive, non-aggressive. But in the beginning, she is a hyper-aggressive individual. So what is the answer to our question? Potential queens, that is those who are going to become queens, begin their careers as very aggressive individuals, and only later they become meek and docile. So how do they become queens in the first place? We have answered. So we have some confidence that they are meek and docile sitters. But don't have too much confidence in this, because this raises other questions. If she is aggressive only for 1 week, why should the workers obey her for the rest of her life? How will she prevent the workers from challenging her, becoming queens themselves, because they can, for the rest of her career? And an individual wasp can remain as a queen for several weeks or several months. And during all that time, she is meek and docile, non-interactive, non-aggressive sitter sitting in a corner. How does she do this? So until you answer that question, we have to hold our confidence about this question. So we ask those questions. We ask basically 2 kinds of questions. How does she prevent the workers from challenging her and becoming the queens? and how to make sure that they continue to work and not become lazy. I won't go into all of them, but I'm giving you a sample because I want to tell you how we do things. So I have 7 questions. This is probably the second one. Okay, so this question I will spend a little bit of time on because this is very interesting. How does a meek and docile queen prevent the other workers from developing their ovaries and laying eggs and becoming queens? Because they can. And in other species, they do it by harassing them, by physically biting them and making sure that they don't have the time and energy to do this. But here in our species, it's not possible. How do they do that? Now, in order to answer this question, we designed another experiment. Now, we know that in ants and termites and in honeybees, where the colonies are very large, where there are tens of thousands of individuals or maybe even 1 million individuals, it's unthinkable that the queen will go and bite everybody. It's not possible. So how does the queen control there? And it turns out the queen controls there by producing chemicals. They produce chemicals, release these chemicals, and when these chemicals enter the body of the workers, they are literally castrated. They are not able to develop their ovaries, not able. So it's a method of chemical control rather than physical control. So we said maybe our wasp has not read the textbooks, she doesn't know, maybe she's producing a chemical weapon. Let's see whether that is possible. She's not supposed to, because in these kinds of wasps, that's not supposed to happen. But she's also not supposed to be lazy, but she is. So let's do that. So the experiment we did was very interesting, very tedious, but very interesting. Now we brought the colony and put it in a laboratory cage, closed the cage. And on day 1, we studied all the queens, the queen and all the workers like before. Everybody's time activity budget was calculated. On day 2, we did something very different. First, we removed all the wasps, all the adult wasps from the cage. Then we took a knife and we cut the nest in half, two equal parts, and we introduced a wire mesh screen in between. Now, the purpose of the wire mesh screen was to prevent the wasp from going across, but allow volatile chemicals to go through. Not non-volatile chemicals, but any volatile chemicals could go through. Once we introduced the wire mesh screen, then we picked up each wasp, we tossed a coin and decided whether she goes to the left or right. Heads you go to the left, tails you go to the right. Next wasp, heads you go to the left, tails you go to the right. Finally, we don't treat the queen any different because she doesn't look any different. So she gets the same treatment, heads you go to the left, tails you go to the right. So we created these two halves and we could study both halves simultaneously. In other words, recalculate the time activity budgets of all the wasps on both sides of the wire mesh. What do we do on day 3? In the previous experiment, day 3, we returned the queen. Here the equivalent is, we moved the queen from the left to the right. So on day 2, this is the queen-less side. Here, this is the queen-less side. This is the queen right side on day 2, and this is the queen right side. Now, why did we do such a complicated experiment? Because our idea was, if the queen is using a chemical, and if the chemical is volatile, then it will go through. So it should make no difference, even on day 2, even these wasps should be able to smell the queen on the other side, and they should say, we have a queen. So there is no reason for anybody to have other ideas and become hyper-aggressive and become a new queen. So nothing should happen. On day 1, day 2, 3, it should be exactly the same, because the chemical is volatile and it's always. But if the chemical is non-volatile, then these wasps will not be able to smell the queen. They should think we have lost the queen, and one of the workers should become hyper-aggressive and become a potential queen and try to become the next queen. But we know that if you return the queen, she will go back to work, right? So on day 3, that individual who was trying to do that should go back to work because the queen has come back. But here, another individual will say, now we don't have queen, so I can become a hyper-aggressive potential queen. So what you should see, so you will be able to know whether the chemical is volatile or it is non-volatile. And we found that the chemical is non-volatile. We found that on day 1, nobody showed aggression because nobody shows aggression in the presence of the queen. Day 2, on the queen-less side, one individual showed huge amount of aggression. But when we moved the queen to her side, she went back to work. And another individual who was very quiet here suddenly became hyper-aggressive. I hope you will appreciate that we could identify this individual only afterwards. Beforehand, we did not know which individual will become aggressive on the left side, which right. But at the end of the experiment, we went and identified what was this individual doing on day 1. This is what she was doing. What was this individual doing on day 2? This is what she was doing. So, our answer is Ropalidia marginata queens appear to use non-volatile, these chemicals which are produced in the body but released outside the body to have effect on other individuals are called pheromones. Some of you may be familiar with the word hormones. A hormone is a chemical produced in one part of the body and has an effect on some other part of the body. A pheromone is produced in one individual, has effect on another individual. So this queen produces a non-volatile pheromone through which she controls other workers. That was our answer. So you can see how our confidence in previous answers slowly builds up one notch at a time as we answer more and more questions. The more questions you answer, the more your confidence builds. However, it's entirely possible sometimes an answer will say that answer was wrong. That's entirely possible. And that is why it's a cumulative process. That is why I say science is a work in progress. Now, let me give you a little background. So as soon as you remove the queen, one individual becomes hyper-aggressive. And surprisingly, this only takes half an hour. Within half an hour, one individual becomes hyper-aggressive. Nobody challenges her. And she will be the next queen. So an obvious question is, who is this individual? Who is the individual who is suddenly going to become the next queen? Now, I want to tell you that this question bothered us for about 30 years. We tried to identify the individual which will become potential queen before we removed the queen. For 30 years, we failed. Only today, we think we may be able to do it, but we are not sure. But for 30 years, we failed. So we could not identify the potential queen before we removed the queen. But one of my students said, yes, we cannot identify. But somehow I think they all know. The wasps all know. So we said, okay, let's see if we can do an experiment to find out if the wasps know. Now, when we said, do the wasps know, people said, no, this is not scientific enough. So we made our question scientific. We asked the question in the following way. We said, is there a hair designate who has been designated beforehand to become the next queen in case something worse befalls this queen? Is there a hair designate, even though we cannot identify her? Do the other wasps somehow know who this hair designate is? And believe it or not, we found a way to answer this question. Most people said you cannot answer this question. How can you know the mind of a wasp? How can you know what a wasp knows? After a lot of trial and error, we found a way to answer this question. And I'll explain that experiment to you. That experiment was not done in the usual way. It was done in a very different way. The way we did this experiment is we said, let us assume that there is a hair designate. Let us assume that everybody knows except we. Now we will do an experiment and ask, how would the wasp behave if there was a hair designate and if they all knew her identity, how would they behave? So the experiment was, you remember the experiment where we cut the nest in 2 parts and introduced the wire mesh? We used that experiment and we had the following idea. The idea is this. Now this is the nest, let's say. We cut it in half and we introduce the queen and half the workers randomly chosen on one side, the other half. Now let us imagine that we already said there is a hair designate, we are assuming. Let us imagine that the hair designate is sitting here on the opposite side of the queen, just by chance. What do you expect to happen? We know that the wasps here cannot smell this queen. They think they don't have a queen. One individual can become hyper-aggressive. Who will be? Of course, it will be the hair designate. This individual will become the hyper-designate, whom we will call the potential queen. However, if this individual indeed is the hair designate for the whole colony, not just for her side, then she should be acceptable to the other side. So what did we do? We simply moved this individual here and interchanged these two. So now we had a situation where the PQ was on this side and the queen was on that side. Now if she was a true hair designate, she should not be challenged here. Move her back, she should not be challenged. Both sides, she should not. Then she is the true hair designate. But we also realize that the hair designate sitting on the opposite side can only happen in about half the experiments. because there's a 50% chance that she may end up sitting next to the queen, just by chance, right? And now she can't do a damn thing, because the queen is here. However, these wasps know they don't have a queen, and they will probably choose the best amongst them to become a potential queen. But this potential queen is only the best here. She is not the heir designate for the whole colony. So what do? We will move her to the opposite side and bring her face to face with the real heir designate. That is the real heir designate. And now there should be a fight between these two. And we would predict that this individual should go back to work and this individual should become a potential queen, right? But that's not the end of the story. The acid test for this individual is, when I move her to the opposite side, she should be accepted because she is supposed to be the true heir designate. So I move her here and she should also be accepted to this side. Okay. I have not used anything more than common sense. It's just common sense. No formula, no atomic theory, no quantum theory, nothing. Just simple common sense. And what did we find? Now this experiment, as you can imagine, is extremely difficult to do because a lot of manipulation. It is actually much more difficult for the wasps than for us because they would get tired of us with all of this. So my student who had come up with this idea of asking this question, when we came with the experimental design, she said, I'm going to do this experiment no matter how long it takes. And she spent 2 years doing this experiment and managed to do it 8 times. So before we did the experiment, we wrote down clearly what our predictions are. What were our predictions? The first individual to become hyperaggressive should be unacceptable to the opposite side in about half the experiments. And in the other half of the experiment, the second individual should come up and she should be acceptable to both sides. And there should never be a third contender to the throne. If you cut the nest in 2 halves, there should be maximum 2 contenders, not a third one. This is our prediction. And when my student did these experiments, she found that in 3 of her 8 experiments, the first individual to become hyperaggressive sustained on both sides, nobody challenged her. This corresponds to the possible situation where she was actually the heir designate. But in the remaining 5 experiments, she lost. As soon as she came here, she lost. A second individual became hyperaggressive, but she succeeded on both sides. In other words, let me go back one slide. So, in other words, that there is a heir designate and they all know who she is. And whenever I gave talks before we did this experiment, people would always ask me, do you know who the potential queen is? I would say, no, I don't know. Now I could proudly say, we know that the wasps know. So we actually published a scientific paper with the title, we know that the wasps know that who their heir designate is. And what was most interesting for us is that the potential queen 2, the second one, she did not receive a single challenge. That is, in this scenario, when she was brought here, she was not challenged. This one automatically went back to work and this one automatically became hyperaggressive. And that is why we think they all knew. It was not that she had to snatch the throne from her. She was given voluntarily. Even this individual knew that it's not my turn yet. And that is the beauty of the system. There is a heir designate, even though we cannot identify her in the presence of the queen, and all the wasps seem to know who she is. Just think of how complicated they are, how sophisticated they are. In what way are they inferior to us? Keep this at the back of your mind. The next student who came to the lab said, when students come, they always want to do better than their senior students. So I said, oh, my senior has shown that the heir designate, but how does she know there's only one heir designate? Maybe there's a whole queue of heir designate waiting for their turn. I said, do the experiment. So he did the experiment. What he did was he took a colony, identified the queen, removed the queen, identified the potential queen, remove her, see what happens. And when he did that, he showed that there is indeed a queue. And his results are very interesting. He showed that in the presence of the queen, nobody shows aggression. Remove the queen, only one individual shows aggression. We call her the potential queen number 1. But remove her, of the remaining wasps, only one individual. Remove her, only one individual. Remove her, only one. And after 5, he said, I have proved the principle. And in fact, the nice thing is that these individuals were not challenged. I have plotted the graph here to show that the aggression shown by them is this bar, received is this bar, which is essentially 0. So only one and only one individual became hyper-aggressive, and she was not challenged. That means they all knew the cue, the sequence, when is my turn. How do they do all of this? That we don't know, but worth thinking about. There is a long reproductive queue of at least 5 potential queens, but perhaps it is even longer. Maybe all the individuals standing in a queue. For me, what is more surprising than all of them standing in a queue is that they have the patience to wait for their turn. They don't jump out of turn. How do they do this? We know why they do this, because I think it's good for the colony. But how do they do this? These are questions which we still don't know. But if you keep on asking these questions, you can answer them. Now, my last question is about another phenomenon. So there are these colonies. So you might ask, how does a new colony come about? Because colonies have to multiply, they have to grow. New colony comes about because some wasps are dissatisfied with the present arrangement. They go off on their own and start their own colonies. But sometimes they do it alone. A single wasp says, I don't like you at all, I'll go and make my own colony. And the nice thing is, a single wasp can build a nest, lay eggs, protect the eggs, bring food, feed the larvae, and bring her offspring to adulthood completely by herself. So they are not necessarily social, they can be completely solitary. But sometimes a group of individuals go together and they will then build a new nest in which there will be one queen and the remaining will be workers. So we wanted to understand how new nests are made, how they are formed. Surprisingly, for a long time, we could not answer this question. And the reason was very trivial. When we study wasps in nature, we often see new nests are being formed. But you don't know where the wasps came from. You don't know what they were doing beforehand. Who are these? We don't know. When we study wasps in the lab, we see lots of wasps leaving. We don't know where they go. So we could not complete the cycle. We see some wasps leaving and other wasps starting the nest. We don't know, cannot complete the circuit. So we needed a new technology. And the new technology, very simple technology, we built a large cage in which I could put the wasp colony and my student inside. So she can sit and make observations. And now there is enough space for wasps to leave and start a new nest, and we could see both of these. So in the very first instance, we constructed such cages, and in so-called, we call these walk-in cages, where you can walk into the cage. In these walk-in cages, we found already 29 examples of new nests being found from 9 such parental nests. 9 of them were started by single wasp, 20 of them were started by multiple wasps. And this one is particularly interesting, I should tell you about this. When this happens, a group of wasps who seem to be dissatisfied with this nest, they will go off on their own and they will have a meeting. They will stay there, they will interact for some time, and they will decide who will be the queen of the new nest before they start the nest. And if you are unsatisfied, go back to the old nest. We have seen individuals unsatisfied go back to the old nest. We've also seen some individuals unsatisfied go back to the nest. Tomorrow, actually, maybe it's all right, I'll go back. All of this we have seen. So, who are the ones who leave? The aggressive ones and the ones who are well fed. Now, this well fed is very complicated because when wasps find food, they never eat outside. They bring it to the nest and share with everybody. So, who is well fed, we don't know. But there is some natural variation. But when a wasp decides to go and make a new nest, she eats outside the nest before she brings it back, so she makes you sure. So you have to be an aggressive individual and you have to be a well-fed individual in order to. Now imagine if this is what is happening. What should the wasp be doing? The wasp has to decide whether to stay or to leave. If I stay, should I challenge the queen and become the next queen, or should I remain a worker? If I leave, should I accept the position of a subordinate worker, or should I aim to be the worker? When should I leave? So since the wasps are doing this all the time, it must be that they are collecting data every day about themselves. How strong am I? Have I become weak? Have I become old? How strong are my nest mates? Will they let me be the next queen? Am I next in the queue? Or some new smart elect has been born who is going to come over me? What is the environment outside? Is there a drought? Is there enough food? Can I manage outside? So clearly the wasp must be collecting such information and updating their database every day. Only then they'll be able to make these decisions. So clearly the wasp must be making and changing decisions continuously based on updating their information about their internal state and the state of the external environment. Once we realized this, we got a sudden idea. This gave us the hope that if that is true, we can change their behavior. We can change that. Because we know how they are making decisions, let's change their internal state or external state and see whether we can change their behavior. So we asked the grand question. The most grand question we've ever asked. We said, can we make the wasp more selfish or less selfish at our will? Can we change their behavior? Now, what do I mean by selfish? Either overthrow the queen and become the queen, or leave and say, I don't want you, I will start my own colony. This is what I call selfishness. What is altruistic? Stay with the queen, help her to take care of her offspring. Now, we know that in nature they do both, but can we push them in one direction? And if we can, then that means we have understood. The famous physicist Richard Feynman, many of you would have heard the name Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman said, what I cannot build, I do not understand. So I said, if we can make the wasp do something which we desire, then we probably have understood them. So we did this ultimate experiment and we asked this question. So this is why I said this is the holy grail of our field. And what did we do? We already knew they have to be aggressive and they have to be well fed. We don't know how to make them more aggressive, but I know how to make them well fed. So we decided to hand feed the wasp. The surprising thing is, there is food there, they will take and eat a little bit. But if you push it into their mouth, as all mothers would know, they will eat more. Left on the table, they will not eat. So we used that method, we kept on. So my students learned how to feed the wasp. So they take a piece of food, they will take in the forceps and hold it in front of the wasp. And the wasp would either say no or would be afraid and run away. But my student would persist. After a while, the wasp take it and say, oh, that's good. And then they'll come back for more. And they'll come back for more. And she'll do it until they say, and then they will take it and feed it to the larvae. They will give it to others. And she will do this till nobody wants any more food. So we did an experiment in which we provided what we call ad libitum food. That is food kept on the table. Mother goes away, tells the child, when you come back from school, there is food, eat. That is one experiment, one kind of it. In the other, in addition to keeping on the table, we hand fed them. Okay, so there are two kinds of colonies. Now, first of all, we had to prove that when we hand fed them, they actually consume more food than otherwise. And that seemed to be true. There was a 1.7-fold increase in the food consumption where we kept food on the table plus hand fed them compared to only keeping on the table. Now we wanted to know, in these well-fed colonies, where the wasp more selfish? Did they have a higher chance of challenging and driving away their queen? Did they have a higher chance of leaving to go and make their own nest? Answer is yes. There was a 3-fold increase in the probability of leaving and starting your own nest compared to food kept on the table, and there was a 12-fold increase in the probability of challenging your queen and saying, I want to be the next queen. So, yes, we can make them more selfish. We can make them have a higher probability of leaving their nest and founding new nests and getting more what we call direct fitness. Yes, we can make designer wasps. And that's the sort of holy grail. I want to end by saying that I have tried to communicate all this in various ways. There's a little book called Survival Strategy which I have written, And I've said in the preface of the book that my aim is that anybody on the street picks up this book and reads, they should understand. That's how I've written. There is an Indian edition to this. You can look at it. I've also summarized the work of wasps in a slightly more technical book. But more importantly, I want to draw your attention to this new book I've written, where I have talked about how to design experiments in animal behavior. And there is a subtitle here, at trifling cost or no cost, how to do low-cost research, how to do research without any money. All the research I described to you required no money. You just need a little bit of wood to make some cages. We could do from our savings. So we didn't need any money. We didn't need a sophisticated laboratory. We didn't need any sophisticated instrument. So a lot of science can be done this way, and therefore all of you, especially young students who don't have big laboratories, who don't have grants, can still do science. And that's what I've tried to explain in this book. I also write a column which I would like you to see if you have time. And I just want you to notice the title. I've called it More Fun Than Fun. So science should be fun. You should enjoy doing it, then you are highly motivated to do it. There is this website at which you can find all of these. So far I've written 41 articles, but I'll keep writing. This is about all kinds of things, about ecology, evolution, but understandable to many people. And I want to, of course, end by thanking very large number of very passionate students who have worked with me over the decades. The one thing all of us have in common is that we love to watch Ropalidia marginata. Questions come later, answers come later. The main thing is we love to watch this. We are passionately interested in watching this.